She fired him in front of 30 people without asking his name. Vanessa Hawthorne, 30 years old, worth $4 billion, and standing at the top of a company she had controlled for less than 8 months, pointed at Carson Bennett like he was something she'd stepped on and said, "Security, get him out." Carson didn't argue, didn't beg, just picked up his toolbox and walked. What she didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that the quiet man she'd just humiliated held the thread that kept the entire company from unraveling, and she had just cut it. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The morning started the way most of Carson Bennett's mornings did. Badly, then quietly better. He burned the oatmeal. It wasn't a disaster, just the usual kind of small failure that arrived before 6 a.m. when a man was trying to pack a lunch, iron a collar, and help an 8-year-old find her left shoe simultaneously. The smoke detector chirped twice before Carson fanned it down with a dish towel, and from the hallway, a small voice called out, "Dad, it smells like the camping trip." It smells nothing like the camping trip. The one where you burned the hot dogs. I didn't burn them. I caramelized them. He scraped the pot, dumped the remains, and started over with instant oatmeal from the back of the cabinet. "Put your shoes on, Lily." "I only have one." "Then find the other one." A pause. Then, "Found it. It was in the bathroom." Carson didn't ask why. There were questions a single father learned to stop asking, and why is your shoe in the bathroom ranked somewhere near the top of that list? By 6:40, Lily was dressed in her purple jacket with the iron-on butterfly that was slowly peeling at one wing, backpack hanging crooked off one shoulder, spooning instant oatmeal into her mouth at the kitchen counter. She was missing a front tooth, had been for 3 weeks, and it gave her smile a gap-toothed, lopsided quality that Carson found almost unbearably endearing, though he would never say that out loud because she was 8 and had opinions about being called cute. He stood across the counter drinking black coffee that had gone lukewarm, watching her, thinking about the work order on his phone. Climate control failure on the executive floor. Third time this month, the cooling system in Novaris's 42nd floor server-adjacent conference suite had thrown a fault code. The 2 previous repairs had been straightforward, a sensor calibration the first time, a clogged condensate line the second. This one was probably the compressor cycling issue he'd suspected since August, but hadn't been able to get authorized diagnostic time to confirm. He had scheduled the repair for 8:30. He'd be in and out before the morning meeting started. He finished his coffee, rinsed the mug, kissed the top of Lily's head. "Have a good day, Bug." She looked up. "Dad." "Yeah." "If I win the science fair, can I go to the summer camp, the one with the robots?" Carson kept his face neutral. The camp cost $1,100. He had looked it up 3 separate times, hoping the number would change. "Let's talk about winning the science fair first." She seemed to accept this as a yes. She went back to her oatmeal. Carson picked up his toolbox and left. The drive to Novaris Technologies took 22 minutes without traffic, 35 on a bad Tuesday, and this was a Tuesday, so it was 37. Carson didn't mind. He drove a 2014 pickup that had 206,000 miles on it and a heater that worked on its own schedule. The radio got 3 clear stations. He kept it on the one that played old country music, not because he particularly loved old country music, but because it had no commercials. He had worked at Novaris for 11 years. He had started at 21, fresh out of a 2-year technical program, hired as a junior maintenance technician at a time when the company occupied 1 floor of a building on the east side of the city. He had watched it grow, floor by floor, building by building, until it sprawled across a 40-story headquarters in the financial district and employed over 4,000 people. He had fixed the boilers, the elevator hydraulics, the backup generators, the cooling systems, the water treatment loops, the loading dock machinery, the fire suppression infrastructure, and roughly 800 other things that nobody thought about until they stopped working. He was good at his job. He was not flashy about it. He showed up early, worked until the problem was solved, and wrote his reports in plain language that anyone could understand. His supervisor, a compact and perpetually stressed woman named Diane Okafor, had once told him that he was the most reliable person in the entire facilities division, which Carson had accepted with a nod and immediately forgotten about because he wasn't the kind of man who collected compliments. What he was, more than anything else, was tired. Not defeated tired. Not the kind of tired that makes a man mean or distant. Just the particular exhaustion of someone who had been doing the work of two people at the office and at home for a long time without rest. His wife Maya had died 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer, caught late, moved fast. She had been 29. Lily had been 4 years old and had asked for 2 months afterward why her mother's side of the bed was always cold. Carson had never fully answered that question. Some things you don't explain to a 4-year-old. You just climb into their bed at 2 in the morning and hold them until they fall back asleep, and then you lie there staring at the ceiling until it's time to start another day. He parked in the employee garage, badged in through the service entrance, and took the freight elevator up to the 42nd floor with his toolbox and a diagnostic tablet tucked under one arm. He had the work order on his phone, authorized, logged, time-stamped. Diane had submitted it through the facilities management system at 7:15 the previous evening after receiving the fault alert from building automation. Standard procedure. There was nothing irregular about any of it. What Carson didn't know, walking toward the executive-level conference suite with his mind already diagnosing the likely cause of the compressor cycle fault, was that the 42nd floor was hosting something unusual that morning. A quarterly investor briefing. Not the kind that shows up in the regular facilities calendar. The kind that gets organized by executive assistants who assume facilities will simply figure it out. He heard her before he saw her. The voice carried through the frosted glass partition with a particular quality. Not loud exactly, but precise. Every syllable placed with intention. It was the voice of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around her presence. Carson slowed at the corridor junction, double-checking the suite number against his work order. 42C. The fault code originated from the climate control unit servicing suites 42C through 42F. He needed access to the mechanical panel inside the suite's utility corridor, which ran along the back wall behind the presentation screen. He could see through the glass. The room was full. 30, maybe 35 people. Men in expensive suits, a few women dressed in the particular way that said board member rather than employee. There was a presentation on the large screen, charts, projections, growth curves trending upward. At the front of the room, standing with the relaxed authority of someone who had never questioned her right to occupy any space she entered, stood Vanessa Hawthorne. Carson had seen her once before, from a distance. She had joined Novaris 8 months ago after the retirement of the original CEO and a 6-month search process that had apparently concluded she was the future of the company. She was 30 years old, which made her younger than Carson by 2 years and made her the youngest person in the building by a considerable margin on most days. Her net worth was listed in business publications at somewhere around $4 billion, most of it from an earlier tech acquisition that had paid out spectacularly when she was 26. She was by every account Carson had encountered secondhand through Diane in the facilities break room, extremely smart, ruthlessly efficient, and deeply uninterested in anything below the executive level. He had no particular opinion about her. She wasn't someone who had ever intersected with his work. He checked the time, 8:43. The meeting was clearly not scheduled to end soon. He pulled out his phone and texted Diane. 42C has investor meeting running. Should I come back at lunch? Her response came back in under a minute. No, fault is getting worse. Temp in 42 degrees Celsius is rising. Could trip the system entirely. You have access. Go in through the back utility door. Shouldn't disrupt anything. Carson looked at the diagram on his tablet. The utility corridor entrance was at the far end of the suite, a plain door unmarked from the outside that opened into a narrow service passage. He could access the mechanical panel from there without entering the meeting room itself. If he was quiet, nobody would notice him at all. He found the utility door, pressed his badge to the reader. The green light blinked. The lock disengaged. He went in. The utility corridor was narrow, maybe 3 feet wide, running the full length of the back wall. The mechanical panel was exactly where the building schematics said it would be. Carson set down his toolbox, clipped his tablet to the panel housing, and pulled up the fault log. The compressor was short cycling. He'd been right. The refrigerant pressure was dropping below threshold and triggering a protective shutoff, which restarted the system, which overloaded it, which dropped the pressure again. It was a loop. The fix required a pressure adjustment and a check on the refrigerant charge. Probably 30 minutes of work, 40 if the Schrader valve was corroded. He was connecting his manifold gauges when the utility corridor door opened. Not the external door he'd come through, the internal one. The door that connected the utility corridor to the main meeting room. Carson looked up. A man in a suit stood in the doorway, visibly startled. Behind him, through the open door, Carson could see the meeting room, the presentation screen, and 30 heads turning in their direction. "What the—" The man caught himself. "Who are you? What are you doing back here?" "Facilities," Carson said, keeping his voice low. He held up his badge. "Climate control repair. I have an authorized work order. I came in through the external utility access. I wasn't trying to interrupt." "Marcus," a different voice, sharper, coming from inside the room. The man, Marcus, stepped aside. Vanessa Hawthorne walked through the door. She was taller than Carson had expected. Heels, but still. She had the kind of posture that came from a lifetime of being watched, and she looked at Carson the way a person looks at something that has appeared in the wrong place. Not with hostility, exactly, but with a swift categorical assessment. "Who authorized this?" she said. "My facilities supervisor submitted the work order last night. I can show you. I'm asking who authorized access to this floor during a private investor briefing." Carson kept his voice even. "The work order covers that, Ms. Hawthorne. The fault code was flagged as priority. The cooling system serves this entire section of the floor. If it fails completely, you'll lose climate control in the middle of your—" "Stop!" She held up one hand. Not rudely, but absolutely. "You walked into a restricted executive meeting without notifying anyone on this floor. I came through the external utility entrance. I didn't enter the meeting room. You're in a corridor that connects directly to this meeting room. Through a service access door, that's what it's for." Something shifted in her expression. A decision being made, Carson recognized it. Not a careful one, a fast one. The kind that gets made by someone who has learned that speed is its own kind of authority. She stepped back through the internal door, back into the main room, and she did not lower her voice. "I need security up here," she said, loud enough that every person in the room heard it. "And I need whoever authorized unauthorized personnel access to executive spaces during a closed investor session to have an explanation ready, because this—" She gestured toward the utility door, toward Carson, still holding his manifold gauges. "This is not acceptable." Carson stood very still. He heard the room, the shifting of chairs, the murmured conversations beginning at the edges. He could see through the open doorway some of the investors exchanging glances. The particular look of people witnessing something uncomfortable and deciding how to categorize it. He could have pushed back harder. He had the work order on his phone. He had texts from Diane. He had 11 years of employment records and not a single disciplinary note in his file. He had every piece of documentation that proved he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he'd been sent to do. But something about the way she had said it, the public certainty of it, the surgical humiliation of being pointed at in a room full of strangers as if he were a problem to be removed rather than a person to be spoken to, it hollowed something out in his chest. Not anger. Anger would have been easier, something heavier than anger, something closer to exhaustion. Security arrived in 4 minutes. 2 men, professional, not unkind, who looked at Carson with the careful neutrality of people who understood they were entering a situation that had already been decided. "Sir, if you'll come with us." Carson picked up his toolbox. He unclipped his tablet from the panel housing. He left the manifold gauges connected because the work still needed to be done, by someone, eventually. And walking away mid-repair felt wrong in a way he couldn't fully articulate. Vanessa had moved back to the front of the room, but she was watching him leave. The whole room was watching. He looked at her once, not with anger, not with contempt, just looked at her, the way you look at someone who has made a mistake they don't know yet they've made. She didn't look away. She had the kind of confidence that doesn't flinch. In the elevator lobby, the security team asked him to wait. A woman from Human Resources arrived 12 minutes later with a printed document and an expression that suggested she had already had a long day. "Mr. Bennett." She looked at her paper, then at him. "Ms. Hawthorne has requested immediate termination of your employment for unauthorized access to a restricted executive event." Carson looked at the document. I have a work order, he said. I understand. That will be reviewed. But at this point, the compressor on 42C is still short cycling. The system will fail completely within a few hours if it's not addressed. She blinked. Yes, that will be flagged for the facilities team. Diane Okafor. Tell Diane it's a refrigerant pressure issue. She'll know what to do. He paused. The Schrader valve might be corroded. Tell her to check that first. The HR woman stared at him. Carson signed the termination document. He asked for a copy, folded it into his jacket pocket, and took the elevator to the lobby. He turned in his badge at the security desk. He exchanged a long look with Marcus, the guard who had worked the lobby entrance for 6 years and who gave Carson the nod of a man who understood something unfair had just happened and didn't have the power to say so. Outside, the morning was still bright. The city moved around him with its usual indifference. Taxis, pedestrians, a delivery truck double parked on the corner. Carson sat down on a concrete bench near the building's side entrance, set his toolbox between his feet, and looked at his hands. 11 years. He sat with that for a moment. Then he took out his phone. Not to call a lawyer. Not to call the news. He scrolled to a contact he hadn't reached in 3 weeks. A 78-year-old man named Harold Whitlock, who volunteered on Saturday mornings at the Riverside Veterans Community Center, where Carson had spent the last 4 years repairing donated equipment on weekends. The phone rang 3 times. Carson? Harold's voice was the voice of a man who had lived long enough to hear a great many things in a person's tone. It's early for you to be calling. Yeah, Carson said. He looked down at his toolbox. Harold, I'm sorry to tell you this, but I don't think I'm going to be able to make it on Saturdays for a while. I lost my job this morning. I've got some things to figure out. A long pause on the other end. Tell me what happened, Harold said. Carson told him. He kept it short. He didn't exaggerate, didn't editorialize, didn't say a single word about Vanessa Hawthorne that crossed into bitterness. He described the work order, the investor meeting, the utility corridor, the public dismissal. He said it the way he would have written it in a maintenance report, accurate, sequential, without embellishment. When he finished, Harold was quiet for another moment. You doing all right, son? I'm trying to figure out how to tell my daughter we might not make rent. Where are you right now? Sitting outside the building. Go home, Harold said. Take care of Lily. Don't do anything rash. I never do anything rash, Carson said. No, the old man said, and there was something in his voice that Carson couldn't quite read. You never do. They said goodbye. Carson hung up. He sat there another minute, listening to the city, thinking about science camp and peeling butterflies on purple jackets and oatmeal that tasted nothing like burned hot dogs. Then he picked up his toolbox, walked to his truck, and drove home. He didn't know that Harold Whitlock had already picked up his other phone before Carson had even reached the parking garage. He didn't know that Harold had dialed a number he hadn't dialed in 8 months, the direct line to the Novartis Technologies Board of Directors. He didn't know any of that. He was just a man driving home in a truck with 206,000 miles on it, trying to figure out how to explain to an 8-year-old that the world doesn't always treat a person fairly, and that this is not the same thing as saying there's no point in being good anyway. The radio played an old Merle Haggard song. Carson turned it up. Carson got home at 10:14 in the morning, which was not a time he had arrived home on a Tuesday in 11 years. The apartment felt different in the middle of the day. Smaller, somehow. The light came through the kitchen window at an angle that made everything look slightly exposed. The dishes drying in the rack, the crayon drawings magneted to the refrigerator, the stack of Lily's library books on the counter with a juice box sitting on top of them that he kept meaning to throw away. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just looking at it all, the way you look at a familiar room when something has shifted in you and the room hasn't caught up yet. He put his toolbox in the hall closet, hung up his jacket, changed out of his work clothes because standing around in them felt wrong, like wearing a costume for a show that had been canceled. Then he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and started doing the math. He had done versions of this math before, the anxious 2 a.m. accounting that single fathers do when the car makes a noise, or the furnace acts up, or the pediatrician mentions a specialist. But this time it was real, not hypothetical, and reality has a weight that anxiety doesn't. He pulled up his bank account, his last 3 pay stubs, the approximate amount of his next utility bill. He had 6 weeks of rent covered if he was careful. 8 if he cut everything non-essential, which meant the streaming service, the twice-monthly pizza nights, and the slightly better coffee he'd started buying after Lily told him the cheap kind smelled like wet socks. He could file for unemployment. He would today. That would help. He could start applying immediately. There were other facilities positions in the city, and his record was clean. 11 years at a major corporation, no disciplinary history, strong references from Diane and the 3 department heads who had specifically requested him by name for complex jobs over the years. A wrongful termination wouldn't follow him if he handled it right, but right could take time, and time had a cost when you had a mortgage-equivalent rent and a third grader who ate more than anyone would expect from a person her size. The science camp cost $1,100. He closed the laptop. He wasn't the kind of man who spiraled. That was the thing about dealing with real mechanical problems your whole career. You developed a tolerance for the moment of assessment, the honest inventory of what was broken and what tools you had and what needed to happen in what order. Spiraling was inefficient. He had learned that long before Maya died, and her dying had taught it to him in a way that made all other lessons feel minor. He picked up his phone, called the unemployment office, was placed on hold for 22 minutes, filled out the initial application online while still on hold, which felt like a small act of defiance against bureaucratic inefficiency that Maya would have appreciated. When a human finally answered, he provided his information and was told to expect a determination within 2 to 3 weeks. He thanked them and hung up. Then he sat there in the quiet kitchen, in the wrong-angled light, and let himself feel it for just a few minutes, or not the anger, because the anger was still too complicated to look at directly, but the plain, unadorned weight of it. 11 years. He had given that company 11 years of early mornings and late repairs, and unpaid overtime and weekends spent troubleshooting building systems, because the alternative was letting something fail that would affect 4,000 people who needed the lights to stay on, and the elevators to run, and the air to stay breathable. And a woman who had been there 8 months had looked at him like he was a stranger who had wandered in off the street and made her presentation awkward. He let himself feel that. Then he set it down, the way you set down something heavy. You've been carrying a long distance, and he went to the school to pick up Lily 2 hours early because he could now, and because he wanted to. She came out of the classroom with her backpack half-zipped and her butterfly jacket tied around her waist, and an expression of delighted bewilderment at seeing him standing in the pickup lane in the middle of a Tuesday. "Dad, why are you here?" "I took the afternoon off." "You never take afternoons off." "Well," he held out his hand. She took it, which she sometimes did and sometimes didn't, depending on whether she felt 8 or 18 that particular day. Today she apparently felt 8. "Consider it a special occasion." "Is it a bad special occasion or a good special occasion?" He looked down at her. She was too perceptive for her own good. He didn't know where she'd gotten that from. Him, maybe, or Maya, or just some factory setting that certain children came with that allowed them to read the temperature of a room before they'd finished walking into it. "It's just an afternoon," he said. "You want ice cream before dinner and don't tell anyone?" She considered this with appropriate seriousness. "What kind?" "Whatever you want." "Even the one with the cookie dough and the fudge ripple?" "Yeah." "Okay," she said. "Then it's a good special occasion." They went to the place 3 blocks from the school that had been there since before Carson was born, run by a man named Gus, who was 70-something and remembered what flavor everyone ordered. Lily got the cookie dough fudge ripple in a cup because she was going through a phase where cones felt unreliable. Carson got black coffee in a paper cup and didn't get ice cream, which prompted Gus to look at him with the particular concern of an old man who recognizes when another person is not doing well. "Long day?" Gus said. "Long morning," Carson said. Gus nodded and didn't push, which was why Carson had always liked him. Lily ate her ice cream and told him about the science fair project she was planning, something involving plants and different colored lights that her teacher had said was ambitious but good. She explained the hypothesis in terms that were mostly accurate and slightly garbled and completely sincere, and Carson listened to all of it with his full attention, which cost him nothing and which she deserved. When she finished explaining, she looked up at him with the gap-toothed smile and said, "Do you think it could win?" "I think if you do the work right, it has a real shot," he said. "That's not the same as yes." No, but it's what I've got. She seemed to respect that. She went back to her ice cream. He sat with his lukewarm coffee and thought about Harold. The old man's voice on the phone had done something odd at the end of their call, had shifted into a register that Carson couldn't quite name. Not sympathy. He'd heard sympathy, and this wasn't it. Something more like recognition, like someone who has seen a particular shape of event before and knows what it means. Go home. Take care of Lily. Don't do anything rash. Carson was not someone who did rash things. Harold knew that. They had worked side by side on donated hospital equipment and busted HVAC units and a wheelchair ramp that had been built incorrectly by a well-meaning but underskilled volunteer. And in 4 years of Saturday mornings, Harold had never once seen Carson raise his voice or cut a corner or lose his patience with a problem just because the problem was taking longer than it should. What he didn't know, what Carson had no way of knowing, sitting in an ice cream shop with his daughter on a Tuesday afternoon, was what Harold had done with the information he'd been given. Harold Whitlock was not a man who telegraphed his intentions. He had built that habit over 50 years of business, and it had served him well enough that by the time he retired at 72, he had turned a small engineering services firm into one of the most significant technology infrastructure companies in the region. The company was called Novaris Technologies. He had named it himself. He had watched it grow from 12 employees in a converted warehouse into a 40-story operation that employed 4,000 people, and when he had finally stepped back, genuinely stepped back, not the ceremonial stepping back of a founder who still runs everything from the second row, he had done so because he genuinely believed the institution he had built was strong enough to carry on without him. He still owned 41% of the voting shares. He had not mentioned this in 8 months because it had not been necessary to mention it. It became necessary on the morning that Carson Bennett called to apologize about missing his Saturday volunteer shift. Harold listened to everything Carson said. He asked 2 questions. He said goodbye. Then he put down his phone and sat in the study of the house he'd lived in for 34 years, with his arthritic hands folded on the desk and the morning light coming through the oak trees outside the window, and he thought for a long time. He had not built Novaris by being impulsive, but he had also not built it by being passive in the face of things that were wrong. There was a difference between restraint and abdication, and he had learned to know which one he was practicing at any given moment. He picked up the other phone, the one with 3 numbers in it, all board members. The first call was to Patricia Shen, who had served on the Novaris board for 9 years and who answered on the second ring with the professional alertness of someone who always answered on the second ring. Harold told her what he had heard. He kept it factual, the same way Carson had. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. "Harold, are you sure about the work order?" "I'm sure of the man who told me about it," Harold said, "which is more than I can say for the situation as he described it." Another pause. "That's a serious allegation about a termination decision. It's a description of an event. What it alleges is a matter for the board to determine." He paused. "I'd like an emergency session, this afternoon if possible." Patricia exhaled slowly. "I'll make the calls." The second call was to Richard Osei, the board's governance chair, who was less measured in his response. Richard had been skeptical of Vanessa Hawthorne's appointment from the beginning, not from personal hostility, but from a methodical concern about the pace of the changes she had proposed and the confidence with which she proposed them before she had had enough time to understand what she was changing. He had been outvoted. He had accepted the decision professionally. He had spent the past 8 months watching with the careful attention of a man who has put his concern on record and is now waiting to see whether he was wrong. "What's the name of the employee?" Richard asked. "Carson Bennett, senior facilities engineer, 11 years of service." And she fired him in the middle of an investor briefing, publicly. According to his account, yes. Richard was quiet for a moment. "Get me access to his employment file before the session. And Harold, I want the facilities work order log. All of it, not just this morning." Harold said he would arrange it. The third call was to the board's outside legal counsel, a firm that had represented Novaris since its early years, and whose senior partner owed Harold nothing except the same obligation she owed every client, which was honest counsel delivered without softening. Her assessment was brief. If the facts were as described, The termination was procedurally indefensible and potentially actionable. More concerning, she said, was the pattern that a single termination could expose. She recommended the board obtain HR records for all terminations in the past 8 months before the session began. Harold thanked her and set down the phone. He sat for another moment. Then he picked up the first phone again and called the Riverside Veterans Community Center, where a retired Army logistics coordinator named Bev ran the volunteer program with the organizational precision of someone who had once managed supply chains across 3 countries. He asked Bev to pass along to the regular Saturday crew that Harold wouldn't be there this weekend. She said she understood. She asked if everything was all right. He said that it would be, and he meant it, though he also knew it was going to get messier before it got cleaner. Things usually did. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the board session had been confirmed for 4 o'clock. By 2, Patricia Shen had obtained Carson's employment file through the HR director, who had handed it over with the expression of someone who had been waiting for someone to ask. By 3, Richard Osei had the facility's work order logs and had found not only the climate control repair request from the previous evening, but 7 other authorized work orders over the past 3 months that showed Carson Bennett working on floors requiring executive clearance, all logged, all processed, all unremarkable until the morning someone decided to be outraged about them. He also found something else. 3 other facilities employees, all with over 5 years of service, had been terminated in the past 8 months. No documented investigations, no written warnings. HR notes listed the reasons in terms that were vague enough to mean almost anything: performance concerns, culture fit, restructuring of duties. There were no supporting documents, no employee statements, no supervisor reviews. Richard read through all of it twice. Then he called Patricia. "This isn't just Bennett," he said. Patricia had clearly already reached the same conclusion. "No. We have a pattern. We have the beginning of what looks like one, yes. Harold knew, didn't he? That's why he called us today instead of waiting." Harold called us today because a man he respects called him to apologize for missing a volunteer shift, Patricia said. The rest of it we found ourselves. Richard thought about that. That's actually worse, isn't it? That a man who just lost his job after 11 years, his first instinct was to call about the volunteer shift. "Yes," Patricia said. "I think that's rather the point." The board session convened at 4:07 p.m. in the second-floor conference room that served as the backup to the 42nd floor suite, which, as it happened, was still experiencing climate control issues because Carson's repair had never been completed, and the system had failed entirely at 2:45 p.m., exactly as he had predicted. 4 executive meetings had been relocated. 3 investor calls had been rescheduled. The afternoon had been expensive in ways that had nothing to do with money. Harold arrived with a printed copy of Carson's employment file under his arm. He set it on the table without comment and took his seat at the far end, where he had always sat. Vanessa Hawthorne was present. She had been informed of the emergency session 45 minutes earlier and had arrived with her chief of staff and a composure that appeared to anyone watching carefully to cost her some effort to maintain. She was 30 years old, and she was in a room with people who had collectively been navigating institutional complexity for longer than she had been alive, and she was smart enough to understand that the energy in the room was not neutral. She looked at Harold once, briefly, when he sat down. He looked back at her with the patient, weathered attention of a man who has sat across from a great many people over a great many years and learned to separate what they present from what they are. Patricia Shen opened the session. She laid out the facts in the order they had been established: the work order, the authorization, the utility corridor access, the public termination, the lack of investigation, the timeline. She did not editorialize. She presented the employment file summary. 11 years, exemplary record, commendations from 4 separate departments. Then she presented the 3 other terminations. The same pattern, the same absence of documentation. Vanessa listened to all of it. When Patricia finished, she spoke. "I acted to protect the integrity of a private investor event," she said. "An unauthorized individual." "Authorized," Richard said. Not loudly, just clearly. Vanessa paused. "The authorization wasn't communicated to my office or to event security?" "That's an administrative failure," Richard said, "not a disciplinary one. Certainly not one that justifies immediate termination of a senior employee with an 11-year record in front of 30 investors without a single question asked. I made a judgment call under pressure. Yes, Harold said. It was the first thing he'd said since the session began. Everyone looked at him. He folded his hands on the table and continued. You made a judgment call. That is your right as CEO. And the board is now making a judgment about that judgment call, which is our right. What I'd like to understand, he paused, looked at her directly, is not whether you had the authority to fire him. You did. What I'd like to understand is whether you think you were right. The room was very quiet. Vanessa looked at Harold for a long moment, and some small, honest thing, moved across her face that her composure almost, but not quite, covered. I don't know all the facts, she said finally. No, Harold said. You didn't know them before either, and you acted anyway. He said it without cruelty, without triumph. He said it the way a person says a thing that is simply true and doesn't need decoration. The board session lasted another 2 hours. By the time it ended, Carson Bennett did not yet know his name had been spoken in that room 17 times, or that his employment file had been passed around a table by people with the power to change what happened next, or that the retired founder of the company that had just fired him had spent the afternoon making phone calls on his behalf without telling him a single word about it. He was at the park, near the apartment, sitting on the same bench he'd sat on since Lily was small enough to need him nearby at the swings. She was not on the swings anymore. She was on the climbing structure at the far end, navigating a particularly complicated section near the top with the focused intensity she brought to all physical challenges, which was the same intensity she brought to science hypotheses and to arguments about bedtime, which was, Carson had come to accept, simply how she was built. He watched her climb. He thought about the termination paper in his jacket pocket. He thought about the manifold gauges he had left connected to the panel on the 42nd floor and whether anyone had gone back to finish the repair. He thought about Harold's voice on the phone, go home, take care of Lily, don't do anything rash, and the strange undercurrent in it that he still couldn't name. Lily reached the top of the climbing structure and turned around to look for him. When she found him on the bench, she raised one arm and waved with the whole-body enthusiasm of a person who has accomplished something worth witnessing. Carson raised his hand back. She stayed up there for a minute, surveying the park from her height with the satisfaction of someone who had earned the view. Then she started climbing back down, carefully, the way she'd learned, checking each handhold before she committed to it. He had taught her that. Check before you commit. It was advice about climbing structures, and it was advice about other things, and she had absorbed it the way children absorb the things their parents repeat until it becomes part of their operating system. He wished someone had given Vanessa Hawthorne the same advice this morning. He didn't think it with bitterness. He thought it with something closer to the weariness of a man who has fixed enough broken things to understand that almost all of them broke because someone moved too fast. Lily hit the ground, dusted her hands on her jeans, and came running back across the grass toward him. Her jacket was tied around her waist again, and her backpack was abandoned on the bench next to him, and she was, in that particular moment of late afternoon light and running child and the smell of cut grass and the weight of an unresolved problem in his pocket, the clearest proof he had that the day hadn't been entirely lost. She dropped onto the bench beside him, breathing hard. I made it to the top, she announced. I saw. The part near the left side is really hard. You looked like you handled it. She leaned against his arm. He let her. After a moment, she said, Dad, is something wrong? He looked down at her, the gap-toothed face, the butterfly jacket, the unzipped backpack with a drawing sticking out of the top pocket. He could see the corner of it, blue and yellow, something she'd made in school. Something happened at work today, he said. I'll tell you about it at dinner. It's going to be okay. He paused. It might take a little time to be okay, but it will be. She considered this with the same seriousness she gave to science hypotheses. Promise? He had a rule about promises. He didn't make them unless he meant them, and he didn't mean them unless he believed them. Yeah, he said. I promise. She seemed to accept that. She pushed off the bench and went back toward the climbing structure, apparently having more territory to conquer before the light ran out. Carson sat alone on the bench. Across the city, in a second-floor conference room, The Novaris Board of Directors was concluding an emergency session. Documents were being initialed, decisions were being made. A process had begun that Carson knew nothing about, triggered by a phone call he had made to apologize for missing a Saturday shift. And the thing about that, the strange, almost absurd thing about that, was that it was the most Carson-like thing in the entire story. He hadn't called to report an injustice. He hadn't called looking for help. He had called because he thought an old man deserved to know why he wouldn't be there on Saturday. That was all. And that, it turned out, was enough. The board session ended at 6:23 p.m. Harold was the last to leave the conference room. He sat for a few minutes after the others filed out, not because he was tired, though he was, the particular tiredness of a man who has spent an afternoon doing something that mattered and knows the cost of mattering, but because he wanted a moment alone with what had just happened before the world outside the room got hold of it. The file was still on the table in front of him. Carson's employment record. 41 pages, which sounded like a lot until you remembered it represented 11 years of a man's professional life, and then it sounded like almost nothing. Harold had read all of it during the session. He had read it the way he used to read engineering specs back when he still did that kind of work, looking not just at what was there, but at what the pattern of what was there told you about the thing as a whole. What it told him was this: Carson Bennett had been, by every measurable standard the company had, an exceptional employee. Not exceptional the way people said it in performance reviews when they meant good enough and uncomplicated. Exceptional in the actual sense, above the expected level, consistently, over a long period of time, without apparent need for recognition. The commendations were what stayed with Harold. There were 11 of them over 11 years, each from a different department head or senior manager, each describing a specific situation in which Carson had done something that went beyond the scope of his position. A written thank you from the head of the data infrastructure team after Carson had identified and repaired a cooling fault that would have caused a server room failure during a critical system migration. A formal letter from the VP of Operations after he had worked through a weekend to restore elevator service after a hydraulic failure left 2 employees stranded on a high floor during an evening event. A handwritten note, actual handwriting, which told Harold something about the sincerity of it, from a department coordinator who wrote that Carson had fixed the heating system in the record storage area on his own initiative after noticing the temperature was affecting document preservation without being asked, without filing a work request, just because he saw the problem and understood it needed to be solved. 11 commendations, no disciplinary actions, not a single note of performance concern in 11 years. And she had fired him in 4 minutes in front of 30 people without reading a single page of it. Harold closed the file. He picked up his jacket and his phone and walked out of the conference room into the corridor, which was quieter now, the building settling into its evening mode. Cleaning crews moving through the floors, the last of the day's meetings concluding, the particular atmospheric shift that happens in large office buildings when the official day ends and the unofficial one begins for everyone who is still there. He thought about Carson sitting on that bench outside the building at 10 in the morning with his toolbox at his feet. He thought about the way Carson had described what happened, factually, briefly, without bitterness, and then apologized for being unable to make Saturday shifts. The apology had come first. That detail had not left Harold's mind since the call. He pressed the elevator button and waited. In the years when he had run Novaris himself, Harold had made his share of wrong calls. He knew what it felt like, the specific queasy clarity that arrived 24 or 48 hours after a decision, when the emotional pressure that had driven it had dissipated, and you could see the shape of what you'd actually done. He had never fired someone in front of investors without asking a single question. But he had moved too fast on other things, had been too certain on days when certainty wasn't warranted, had occasionally let the performance of authority substitute for the practice of it. He was not without sympathy for how a room full of people and a disrupted presentation could narrow a person's thinking. What he lacked sympathy for was the unwillingness to correct it. That was the part that had decided things in the board session. Not the termination itself, though that was serious. It was the moment when Patricia Shen had laid out the employment file summary and Vanessa had not said, "I didn't know the way someone says it," when they're genuinely confronting new information. She had said it the way someone says it when they're repositioning. There was a difference, and everyone in the room over the age of 50 had recognized it. The elevator arrived. Harold rode it down to the lobby alone. He had one more call to make before morning. Not tonight. Tonight was too soon, and Carson needed one more evening of not knowing what was coming. But tomorrow. Tomorrow he would drive to Carson's address, which he had obtained from the HR directory, and he would have a conversation that he had been composing in his head since approximately 3:30 in the afternoon. He hoped Carson would be home. He hoped, more than that whatever he found there would match what he believed he knew about the man. In Harold's experience, people were usually who they appeared to be. Usually. But he had been wrong before, and he was old enough to stay careful. The lobby doors opened onto the evening city. Harold walked to where his car was waiting, got in, and told the driver to take him home. Behind him, the building's 42nd floor was still running warm. Nobody had gone back to finish the repair. Carson found out the next morning from Diane. She called it 7:52, which was early enough that he was still in the kitchen making the non-burned version of oatmeal, while Lily ate cereal at the counter and argued with her own reflection in the darkened phone screen about whether she needed to wear the heavy jacket or just the butterfly one. The name on his phone screen said Diane Okafor, and Carson felt something tighten in his chest before he answered. Not dread exactly, but the anticipatory alertness of a person who knows that some calls arrive carrying more than the caller intends to say. Carson. Her voice was careful. How are you doing? All right, he said. He moved away from the counter toward the window. How's the 42nd floor? A pause. It failed completely at 2:45 yesterday. We had to move 4 meetings. I know, I told the HR woman it would. He kept his voice flat. Schrader valve? Corroded, yeah. Martinez fixed it last night. A longer pause. I want you to know that I've submitted a formal grievance on your behalf through HR. I documented the work order, the authorization process, everything. I should have called you yesterday. It was a difficult afternoon up here. I figured it was. There's also... She stopped, started again. There's something happening at the board level. I don't know the details. But the HR director pulled your file yesterday afternoon and not at my request. Carson was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the neighbor's kid was waiting for the school bus on the corner, backpack enormous, looking at his phone with the boneless patience of a teenager who has not yet learned to be impatient. What kind of something? Carson said. I don't know. I genuinely don't. But Patricia Shen's assistant called our department this morning asking for the complete facility's work order log for the past 8 months. That's not a routine request. Carson processed this. Okay. That's all you've got? What else should I say, Diane? I don't know, Carson. Most people would say something a little more. She seemed to stop herself. You're not going to get angry about any of this, are you? Not especially. Why not? He thought about it for a second. Honest answer. Because I was authorized. I know I was authorized. Whatever they find when they look, they're going to find that. A pause. I just want to know that Martinez is aware about the refrigerant pressure. The compressor needs a charge check after the valve replacement, not just Carson. What? You just got fired. Can you please be upset about that for 1 minute before you give me compressor notes? He almost smiled. Almost. I can be upset and still care about the compressor. She made a sound that was somewhere between exasperated and fond. You are an impossible person. So I've been told. After he hung up, Lily was looking at him from across the kitchen counter with the expression she made when she was assembling information. He recognized it because it was the same expression he saw in the mirror sometimes, just smaller and rounder and with a juice box mustache. Who was that? My coworker Diane. Is it about the job thing? He had told her the previous evening over the spaghetti he made because she requested it and because it was cheap and because cooking something gave his hands something to do while he found the words. He had told her plainly, lost my job, not sure why yet, going to be tight for a while, we're going to be okay. She had listened to all of it with a focused quiet, and then she had asked 2 questions. Was it your fault, and do you have enough money for school lunches? He had said no to the first and yes to the second, and she had seemed to accept both answers and gone back to her spaghetti. Now she was looking at him with the assembled information expression. Is it about the job thing? She repeated. Maybe, he said. I don't know yet. Diane sounds nice. She is. Is she going to fix it? I don't think it's hers to fix, Bug. Lily pulled the heavy jacket off the hook by the door without being asked. Progress. Then whose is it? Carson looked at his daughter, putting on her jacket with the wrong arm first, the way she always did, switching it halfway through the motion without breaking stride. We'll see, he said. He dropped her at school and drove back through the city that was already mid-morning loud. Deliveries, construction on the corner of 5th, a jackhammer doing its level best to make thinking difficult. He stopped at the coffee place near the apartment because the good coffee felt justified today, even if it was $4, and he sat at the window table and opened his laptop and started updating his resume. He was 45 minutes into it when the knock came on his apartment door. He wasn't at the apartment, you see. He was at the coffee place, but when he came home at 11:15 to eat something before spending the afternoon applying for positions, a note had been slipped under the door. A small card, cream-colored, handwritten in the deliberate script of someone who had learned to write before keyboards made handwriting optional. Carson, I'd like to speak with you at your convenience. I'll be available this afternoon. H. Whitlock, 555-0147. Carson stood in the hallway holding the card for a long moment. Then he sat down on the floor in the hallway, back against the wall, because his legs had made a decision without consulting the rest of him. Harold hadn't told him. On the call yesterday morning, Harold had known something. Carson could hear it now, in retrospect, the careful deliberateness of, go home, don't do anything rash. And he hadn't said a word about it. Just listened, asked his 2 questions, and sent Carson home to take care of his daughter. And then, apparently, had done something. Had done something significant enough that Diane's HR director was pulling files and Patricia Shen's office was requesting 8 months of work order logs. Carson did not yet know the full shape of what Harold had set in motion. He would understand more later, much more. But at this moment, sitting on the floor of his apartment hallway with a cream-colored card in his hand, what he understood was smaller and more personal than corporate governance or board sessions or the procedural consequences of wrongful termination. What he understood was that an old man he had met 4 years ago over a broken centrifuge at a veterans center had, in whatever way was available to him, tried to do right by someone he believed had been wronged. That was what it was. Before it was anything else, it was that. He called the number on the card. Harold answered on the 3rd ring. Carson? Harold, I got your note. Good. I wasn't sure you'd be home. A brief pause. Can I come by this afternoon? Say 2 o'clock? You can come now if you want. Carson stood up off the floor, brushing nothing off his jeans out of habit. I'm not exactly busy. 2 o'clock is fine, Harold said, in a tone that suggested 2 o'clock was what he had planned and would remain what he planned regardless. I'll see you then. Carson spent the intervening hours finishing his resume, eating a sandwich over the kitchen sink, and not thinking too hard about what the conversation was going to be. He was not a catastrophist, and he was not an optimist. He occupied the practical middle ground of someone who had learned that most situations were neither as bad as feared nor as good as hoped, and that the best thing to do was be present when the actual information arrived. At 1:57, a car pulled up outside. At 2 exactly, the knock came. Harold Whitlock was taller than Carson had expected, though he couldn't have explained what he'd expected from a voice on a phone. 78, which Carson knew, but carrying it in the way some people carried age, not as diminishment, but as accumulation. He was dressed plainly, dark slacks and a gray sweater, and he carried nothing except a manila envelope that he held at his side, with the casualness of someone who had learned not to make documents look more important than they were by the way you held them. Carson. He extended his hand. Carson shook it. Come in. Sorry about the... He gestured vaguely at the apartment. It's a little lived in. I have grandchildren, Harold said. I know what lived in looks like. He stepped inside, took in the kitchen, the crayon drawings on the refrigerator, the library books on the counter, the half-finished model of some kind of spacecraft on the coffee table that Lily had been constructing for 3 weeks. He didn't comment on any of it, but his expression did something quiet and settled. Carson offered coffee. Harold accepted. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Carson had done the math 2 days ago, where Lily ate oatmeal with the gap-toothed smile. where normal life happened in the way that normal life insists on continuing even when other things are falling apart around it. Harold set the manila envelope on the table between them and did not open it. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I want to tell you before you hear it from anyone else." He looked at Carson steadily. "I'm the founder of Novaris Technologies. I still hold the controlling interest." Carson looked at him. He held Harold's gaze and did not look away, and for a long moment neither man said anything. Then Carson put his coffee cup down. "Saturday mornings," he said. "Saturday mornings," Harold agreed. "You fixed a centrifuge." "I fixed several centrifuges. I find the work satisfying." A pause. "I did not tell you who I was because it wasn't relevant to the work we were doing, and because—" he seemed to consider the next part carefully, "because I have found in my experience that people behave differently when they know who they're talking to. I preferred to know who you were before you had any particular reason to manage my impression of you." Carson was quiet for a moment, processing. He was not a man who got angry fast, but he felt the edges of something complicated moving through him. Not betrayal, not quite, because Harold had done nothing dishonest exactly. But the particular disorientation of realizing that a relationship you understood has had a dimension to it you didn't know about. "Is that what Saturday was, he said. "An audition?" Harold shook his head. "No. The first Saturday was an old man showing up to volunteer. Every Saturday after that was two people doing work that needed doing. I had no agenda." He paused. "Until Tuesday morning, when you called to apologize for missing a shift." Carson looked at his coffee. "I called the board," Harold said. "I requested an emergency session. I provided your employment file." He slid the manila envelope across the table. "I thought you should see what they found when they looked." Carson opened the envelope. Inside was a summary document, 12 pages, printed, marked at the top with the Novaris board seal. He read it slowly. He was not a fast reader because he was not a reader who skimmed. He had the same methodical attention with text that he brought to diagnostic readouts, which meant he caught things. He caught the paragraph about the 11 commendations. He caught the section on the other 3 terminations, the ones that had happened before his, the pattern that his own firing had made visible by completing it. He caught the line that described Vanessa Hawthorne's actions as in violation of established HR procedure and inconsistent with the company's stated commitment to due process for all employees. He set the document down when he reached the end. "What happened to her?" he said. "She's been relieved of active leadership pending a full review of her tenure." Harold's voice was even. "The board will determine what comes next." Carson nodded slowly. "And the other 3, he said, "the ones who were let go before me." "The board is reviewing those terminations as well. They'll be contacted." Another nod. "That's good." He picked up his coffee, which had gone cold. "What happens to me in all of this?" Harold looked at him directly. "That's actually what I came to talk to you about." He explained what the board had discussed, the gap that Carson's situation had exposed, the lack of any formal mechanism for ensuring that experienced employees had representation in consequential decisions. The board's conclusion that this gap was not just a procedural problem, but a cultural one, and that fixing it required more than updating an HR policy. It required someone in a position with real authority whose job was specifically to ensure that the people who kept the company running were not invisible to the people who made decisions about the company. "We'd like to create the position," Harold said. "Director of Operational Integrity. It would report to the board directly, not to the CEO's office. The mandate would be to protect the interests of employees in operational roles, to ensure procedural fairness, to maintain the kind of institutional knowledge that gets lost when experienced people are dismissed without consideration." He paused. "We'd like you to take it." Carson sat with this for a long moment. A lesser version of himself, the version that existed only in imagination, the one that harbored resentment and wanted satisfaction, might have felt something triumphant in this moment. Might have felt the clean arc of a narrative, the satisfying inversion of circumstances. But he didn't feel that. He felt something more complicated and more honest. He felt the weight of what was being offered alongside the awareness of why it was being offered, and those two things together made him careful in a way that triumph never would have. "I'm a facilities engineer," he said. "I know what you are," Harold said. I don't have an executive background. I've never managed a department, never been in a board meeting, never. Carson. Harold leaned forward slightly. In 11 years, you walked into every broken system in that building and you figured out what was wrong and you fixed it without being told how. You documented everything, you communicated clearly, and you never cut a corner because cutting a corner was easier. He paused. I am not looking for someone with an executive background. I am looking for someone with exactly the qualities I just described. The executive skills can be developed. The qualities cannot. Carson looked at the man across from him. 78 years old, with big knuckled hands that had actually held tools, who had showed up to a veterans community center on Saturday mornings for reasons that were, it turned out, exactly as simple as they had appeared. I have one condition, Carson said. Harold waited. No employee gets let go without a real process. Not a procedural checkbox, an actual process. Someone looks at the file. Someone talks to the person. Someone asks the question before they make the decision. He held Harold's gaze. If I take this job and that doesn't happen, I won't be able to do what you're asking me to do. Harold looked at him for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of confirmation. The look of a man whose instinct has been vindicated by evidence. I'll put it to the board tomorrow morning, he said, but I don't think you'll have an argument. Carson nodded. Harold gathered the envelope. He finished his coffee. He stood up from the kitchen table with the careful deliberateness of a man who had learned not to rush the transition between sitting and standing, and Carson stood with him. At the door, Harold paused. For what it's worth, he said, I'm sorry it happened the way it did. You deserve to be treated with more consideration than you were. Yeah, Carson said. He thought about standing in the utility corridor with his manifold gauges, while 30 people looked at him through an open door. He thought about the security team with their professional neutrality. He thought about the HR woman's face when he'd asked her to pass along the compressor notes. I know. Harold nodded once. Then he walked down the hallway toward the elevator and Carson watched him go. He stood in the doorway for a moment after Harold had gone, one hand on the frame, looking at the empty hallway. The fluorescent light at the far end was flickering, had been flickering for 2 weeks, which he had mentioned to the building super twice. He made a mental note to mention it a third time. Then he went back inside. He called Diane. She picked up on the first ring, which told him she'd been waiting. Carson, I have some things to tell you, he said. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Diane said almost nothing for the first 15 of them, which was so unlike her that Carson checked twice to make sure the call hadn't dropped. When she finally spoke, what she said was, You're going to be terrible at the political parts of being an executive, you know? Probably, he agreed. You don't even own a suit. I own one suit. Does it still fit? A pause. Mostly. She made the exasperated fawn sound again. Carson. I'll get another suit. You're really going to do this? He looked around the kitchen. The crayon drawings, the library books, the spacecraft model on the coffee table waiting for Lily to come home and add the next piece. Whatever came after the one she'd placed 2 nights ago with the fierce concentration of someone solving something important. Yeah, he said. I think I am. After he hung up, he had 2 hours before school pickup. He spent half an hour on the phone with the HR department of a position he had applied to that morning, withdrawing his application with apologies and a thank you. He spent another 20 minutes updating his notes on the apartment building's maintenance issues because he was still going to mention the flickering light to the super a third time. Then he sat at the kitchen table with the summary document from the board in front of him, and he read it again, more slowly this time. He read the section on the other 3 employees. He read their names. Gutierrez, Park, Okonkwo. He didn't know any of them personally, but he knew the departments they had come from, knew the institutional knowledge that walked out the door with each one. He made a note of the names on the back of an envelope. First thing, if this went the way Harold expected it to go, he was going to ask about those 3. Not because someone told him to. Not because it was in the job description, but because they had been treated the same way he had been treated, without the accident of knowing someone who happened to control 41% of the voting shares. And that imbalance was exactly the kind of thing that a director of operational integrity was supposed to exist to correct. He folded the envelope and put it in his jacket pocket, next to the termination document he still hadn't thrown away. Outside, the afternoon light was doing what it did in late fall, going golden and brief, the particular light that made ordinary things look like they meant something. He stood at the kitchen window and watched it move across the buildings on the opposite side of the street, the way it caught the windows and turned them briefly amber. And he thought about 11 years, and he thought about what came after 11 years. He thought about Lily's science fair project, the plants and the colored lights, the careful hypothesis, the ambitious but good ambition of a child who had not yet learned to underestimate what was possible when you did the work right. He thought he would ask her tonight, over dinner, to tell him the whole hypothesis from the beginning. He had heard it once, at the ice cream place, through the filter of his own distraction. He wanted to hear it again properly, with his full attention, the way it deserved to be heard. He had that now. Time. Attention. Acquiring things from him he wasn't sure yet he could provide. The political navigation Harold had suggested he could learn. The executive fluency that would have to be acquired alongside the job rather than before it. The particular challenge of walking into a company that had just fired him and asking it to trust his judgment. But not worse. He had stood in a utility corridor 3 days ago with his manifold gauges and done the work he was there to do, and when someone had pointed at him like he was the problem, he had not become the problem. He had picked up his toolbox and walked out with his dignity intact and left the gauges connected because the repair still needed to be done. That, it turned out, was what integrity looked like from the outside. From the inside, it just felt like being too tired for the alternative. The afternoon light shifted. A cloud moved. The amber in the windows across the street faded back to ordinary glass. Carson went to get his daughter from school. The board voted unanimously the next morning. Carson didn't know this until Harold called at 9:47, which was 23 minutes after Lily had left for school and 7 minutes after Carson had made his second cup of coffee and sat back down at the kitchen table with a legal pad he'd been using to sketch out what he thought the Director of Operational Integrity position would actually need to accomplish in its first 90 days. He had started the list at 6 in the morning because he hadn't slept well. Not from anxiety exactly, more from the particular restlessness of a mind that has been given a real problem and keeps turning it over in the dark, looking for the seams. "It's done," Harold said. "Unanimous. The position is approved. Your condition about procedural process is written into the mandate. Specifically, no termination of any employee with more than 1 year of service without a documented review and direct conversation with that employee's department head. It's going into the revised HR policy this week." Carson looked at his legal pad. "All right. You sound like I told you the weather." "I believed you when you said it wouldn't be an argument." He paused. "When do you need an answer?" "I'd appreciate one today," Harold said. "The board is managing some sensitive communications around the leadership transition, and they'd like to announce your appointment at the same time, if you're willing." "I'll call you back in an hour," Carson said. He did not spend the hour agonizing. He spent 20 minutes of it walking around the neighborhood, past the school, past the coffee place, past the ice cream shop that was dark and gated in the morning, and the remaining 40 minutes back at the kitchen table finishing the list he'd started at 6. By the time he picked up the phone to call Harold back, the list had 37 items on it, organized not by priority exactly, but by sequence, the order in which things needed to happen for later things to be possible. Item 1. Contact Gutierrez, Park, and Okonkwo. He called Harold, said yes. Harold said good. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. What followed that 4-minute call was 2 weeks that Carson would later describe to Diane in one of their regular end-of-day debriefs that had become the informal infrastructure of his new role as the most disorienting professional experience of his life, which was saying something for a man who had once spent 14 hours in a flooded mechanical room trying to restore power to a hospital-adjacent data facility during a storm. The disorientation wasn't the work. The work he understood, or at least he understood how to approach it, which was the same thing he had always done with problems he hadn't encountered before. Break it into components, identify what was actually broken versus what only appeared broken, Address the structural issue before cosmetic ones. Document everything. What he didn't understand and had to learn by doing in a way that was frequently uncomfortable was the social geography of executive-level employment, the particular language people used in board communications, the way a room full of senior managers oriented themselves when a new variable entered their established hierarchy. The difference between how people talked when they wanted to communicate something and how they talked when they wanted to appear to communicate something while actually communicating something else entirely. He sat through 3 executive meetings in his first week and understood approximately 60% of what was actually being said, which he estimated was probably higher than it would have been for most new executives and lower than it needed to be for him to do his job well. After the 3rd meeting, he went back to his new office, a mid-level space on the 28th floor, not executive row but not facilities level either, and in between that suited him, and wrote up his notes with the same methodical honesty he'd always brought to maintenance reports. What he understood, what he didn't, what he needed to know more about, where the gaps were. He had learned to do this as a junior technician at 21. Don't pretend to know things you don't know, because pretending costs you the time you could have spent learning. It was advice that applied in conference rooms the same way it applied in mechanical rooms, though the consequences of getting it wrong were different in ways he was still mapping. Diane brought him coffee on his 4th day. She had to knock because he had never had an office with a door before and had not yet developed the instinct to leave it open. "You look terrible," she said, setting the cup on his desk. "I feel approximately terrible, yes." "Is it the meetings or the people?" "The meetings are fine. He searched for the right word. "The register. Everyone talks in a register I'm still translating." Diane sat down in the chair across from his desk, which was also new. He'd had a workbench before, not a desk, and looked at him with the frank attention of someone who had known him professionally for 8 years. "You know what your problem is?" "I suspect you're going to tell me." "You're waiting to understand everything before you say anything. And in executive meetings, if you wait to understand everything before you say anything, you will never say anything, because half of what's being said is specifically designed to be difficult to understand." Carson looked at her. "That seems inefficient." "Welcome to the executive floor." "I'm on 28. "Same principle, lower altitude." She picked up his notepad, looked at the list he'd been refining since the first morning. "You've got 37 items on here. Have you told anyone about any of them?" "I'm still building the case for the sequencing." "Carson," she set the pad down, "you have a mandate from the board and a title that reports directly to Harold Whitlock. You don't need to build a case. You need to start talking to people." He knew she was right. He had always known, in a general way, that his tendency toward thorough preparation sometimes crossed the line into avoidance, the comfortable feeling of not yet being wrong because he hadn't yet moved. Maya had called it his pre-flight checklist problem. She'd said it with affection because she understood where it came from, but she'd also said it clearly because she was someone who believed that naming a thing was the first step to not being controlled by it. He had missed her more than usual in the past week. Not the grief missing, the raw animal kind that had defined the first year after she died. The other kind, the conversational missing, the specific absence of a person who would have had something useful and honest to say about all of this, who would have sat across from him in this unfamiliar office and told him the thing he was avoiding hearing in exactly the tone that made it possible to hear it. Diane was doing her best approximation of that function, and he was grateful for it, though he never said so in those terms because that was not how either of them talked. "I have a meeting with Gutierrez tomorrow," he said. Diane nodded. "And Park and Okonkwo?" "Park is Thursday. Okonkwo is still pending. She's in another city. We're doing a call." "Good." She stood up. "And Carson?" "Yeah. The suit fits fine. Stop pulling at the collar." He had not been aware he was pulling at the collar. He stopped. The meeting with Elena Gutierrez happened at a coffee shop 3 blocks from her current employer. She had found another position 2 months after her Novaris termination, but in a lower-level role that paid less and offered less responsibility. The kind of lateral and down trajectory that happens to experienced people when they are forced to move fast and take what is available rather than what matches what they can do. She was 44, had been a senior operations coordinator at Novaris for 7 years, and she arrived at the coffee shop 10 minutes early and ordered water instead of coffee, which Carson registered as the behavior of someone who didn't want to be obligated to anything before they understood what they'd walked into. He respected that. He told her the situation plainly. The board review, what they had found, the determination that her termination had been procedurally improper, the company's intent to make it right, financial settlement for the period of improper termination, a formal letter correcting her employment record, and if she was interested, a conversation about whether there was a role at Novaris she would consider returning to. Elena listened to all of it without interrupting. She had a still quality that reminded him of the stillness he tried to maintain in high-pressure repair situations. Not passivity, but managed attention. When he finished, she said, "What took 8 months?" It was a fair question. The fairest possible question, actually. "A different decision was made 8 months ago," he said. "A different decision is being made now. By different people." "Mostly, yes." She was quiet for a moment, looking at her water glass. "I had a good record there. 7 years, nothing bad on file. She let me go with 2 paragraphs and no explanation, and I spent 3 months wondering what I had done." "You hadn't done anything," Carson said. "I know that now. I didn't know it then." She looked up. "Do you know what it does to a person? Spending 3 months thinking you must have done something, trying to figure out what it was, because the alternative, well, that it was just arbitrary, was somehow worse?" Carson held her gaze. "I was in that building for 11 years, he said, and I spent about 6 hours sitting with the same question." Something shifted in her expression, not softening exactly, but a kind of recalibration. "6 hours, she said. "Then an old man called me back and I found out I was authorized and always had been." He paused. "You deserved that same call. You should have gotten it 8 months ago. I'm sorry you didn't." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the coffee menu she hadn't opened when she sat down, and she ordered a coffee, and she said, "Tell me about the operational integrity position. What does it actually do?" They talked for an hour and 40 minutes. Carson missed the parking meter and got a ticket, which he discovered when he got back to his truck and found the orange slip under the wiper. He stood on the sidewalk holding it, doing the quick mental calculation of $55 against a conversation that had been worth considerably more than that, and put it in his jacket pocket alongside everything else he was carrying. Park was quieter than Gutierrez, and harder to read. James Park had been a building systems analyst. Carson's department, technically, though they had never worked closely because Park had operated more on the data and reporting side while Carson lived in the physical plant. He was 38, with a careful engineer's manner and the specifically wounded quality of someone who had been let go from a job he was genuinely good at and hadn't yet fully convinced himself it hadn't been his fault. That was the damage Carson hadn't fully anticipated when he thought about those 3 names on the back of an envelope. Not just the financial disruption, not just the career disruption, but the interior damage. The self-doubt that moved in and rearranged the furniture when an institution told you without explanation that you were the problem. It was the same thing Elena had described, the 3 months of wondering. James had been doing his own version of it for 6 months, and it showed in the way he answered questions slightly too carefully, as if expecting the floor to drop. The call with Yolanda Okonkwo was different again. She had been the most senior of the 3. A facilities project manager with 9 years at Novaris, the kind of institutional memory that takes a decade to build and an afternoon to lose. She was direct in the way of someone who has been through enough that indirectness feels like a waste of time. "I want the record corrected," she said, before Carson had finished his second sentence. "That's the priority. Whatever else happens, I need that corrected." "It will be," Carson said. "That's already in process. And I want it in writing from the board. Not HR, the board. I'll make sure of it." "Good." A pause. "Now tell me why you specifically are the one making this call." He told her. The full version. The utility corridor, the investor briefing, the manifold gauges, the termination document, Harold's card under the door. She listened without comment until he finished. "So they created a position," she said. "Yes." "For you?" "Yes." "Because you happen to know Harold Whitlock." The bluntness of it landed squarely. He let it. "That's part of it," he said. "Yes." "And if you hadn't known him, you'd be in the same position I'm in." "Probably worse," he said. I'm a single father with 6 weeks of savings. You found other work. I might not have. Yolanda was quiet for a moment. You're not going to tell me the system worked. No, he said. The system didn't work. The system failed 4 people and almost failed more. What worked was an accident. A man I happened to meet at a veterans center on a Saturday morning who happened to be someone with the authority to demand answers. He paused. The job they gave me exists to make it so that doesn't have to be an accident next time. Another silence. Longer. You actually believe that, she said. Not a question. More like a verification. I wouldn't have said yes otherwise. She said she would think about it. He said he appreciated her time. The call ended and Carson sat in his office on the 28th floor in the suite that fit mostly and thought about what Yolanda had said, because she had said the precise, uncomfortable thing that he had been circling without landing on since Harold had first offered him the position. The accident. That was the word. That was the thing that sat at the center of all of it, the thing that couldn't be dressed up in narrative or institutional language without losing its essential character. He had not been saved by justice. He had been saved by coincidence. 4 years of Saturday mornings at a veterans center that happened to put him in proximity to a man who happened to have power, that happened to be relevant to a wrong that happened to have been done to him. That was the chain. That was the whole chain. The people who deserved the same outcome but didn't have the chain, they were the reason the job existed. And if he did it right, the job would mean that the chain didn't need to be as long, that the next person wouldn't need to know the right old man on the right Saturday morning, that the system itself would catch what it was supposed to catch. That was the idea. Whether it was achievable was a different question, and one he was too new to answer. But he had built enough things from the ground up to know that the gap between an idea and its implementation was where most of the actual work lived, and he was not afraid of where the work lived. He stayed late that evening, not because he needed to perform lateness. He had never understood the culture of visible hours as proof of dedication, had always thought it was one of the more counterproductive habits in professional life. He stayed because he genuinely wasn't done. He was writing the first draft of what would become the Operational Integrity Review Protocol, the actual document, the one that would specify what a proper employee review process looked like, who was responsible for each step, what documentation was required, what timeline was non-negotiable. It was the policy version of what Carson had asked Harold for as a condition of his acceptance, and he was writing it the same way he wrote maintenance reports, in plain language, with specific criteria, without room for the kind of vague, professional-sounding language that looks like accountability while functioning as its opposite. He was on page 6 when his phone buzzed with a text from the school's aftercare program. Lily is the last one here, just a heads up. He looked at the time. 6:47 p.m. He said a word under his breath that he would not have said if Lily were in the room, saved the document, closed his laptop, and left the building at a pace that was technically a walk, but only technically. Lily was sitting on the front steps of the school when he pulled up, backpack in her lap, a book open across her knees. She looked up when she heard the truck. She did not look upset, which told him either that she was fine or that she was doing the thing she sometimes did where she held feelings in storage until a more convenient time to deploy them, which was a habit she had absolutely gotten from him. Sorry, he said, getting out of the truck. It's okay. She closed the book. Mrs. Tamboli let me stay inside until 5:30, then I came out here. Was it cold? A little. She stood up, shouldered her backpack. You were working late. Yeah. Is that going to happen a lot? He took the backpack from her. She let him, which again indicated more charitable feelings than she might otherwise have displayed. They walked to the truck together. Probably for a while, he said, while I'm learning the new job. It should even out. You don't know that. You're right, I don't. He opened the truck door for her. I'm going to try to make sure it does. She climbed in, settled her book on her knees. He went around and got in the driver's side. For a moment, neither of them said anything, just the familiar ambient sounds of the truck settling, the distant traffic, the heating system cycling on with its usual 40-second delay. Dad? Yeah. Is the new job good? Like, are you actually okay with it, or are you just saying you're okay with it? He looked at her. 8 years old and asking the question with exactly the precision it deserved, which was, he had no other word for it, very much her mother. It's hard, he said, and I don't know how to do big parts of it yet. And today I talked to someone who made a really good point about the limits of what the job can actually fix. He paused. But I think it matters. I think if I do it right, it'll matter. Lily considered this with the focused expression she reserved for important information. That's a real answer, she said. I'm trying to give you real answers. She seemed satisfied. She opened her book. He started the truck. They were 3 blocks from the apartment when she said, without looking up from the page, Dad, the science fair is in 6 weeks. I know. I need to start the experiment this weekend. Okay, what do you need? 3 different grow lights and pots, and the same kind of seeds for each one, so the variable is only the light. She turned a page. Also, I think I need a chart. I can help with the chart. The lights are $40 each. He did the math in the particular fast, involuntary way that had been the background process of his financial life for 4 years. $120. Manageable now, in a way it hadn't been a week ago, in a way that still felt new enough to be slightly surreal. We'll get them Saturday, he said. Really? Yeah. She lowered the book and looked at him with the gap-toothed smile. And he had the specific experience. He had it maybe once a month, always unexpectedly, of seeing Maya in her face so clearly that his chest did the thing it still did, even after 4 years, even after all the work of learning to carry it. Not pain, not anymore. Something more like the particular beauty of continuity, of a person you loved being present in the way that people are present after they're gone, in the specific angle of a smile or the cadence of a question. He looked back at the road. You're going to need a notebook too, he said, for the observations. You have to record everything, every day, even if nothing looks different. I know, she said, with the mild patience of someone who has heard this principle applied to many situations and does not require a reminder. You always say that. It's always true. Yeah. She went back to her book. I know, Dad. The apartment was cold when they got in. The building's heat had done its usual thing of not quite keeping up on windy evenings, and Carson turned the oven on for 5 minutes and left the door cracked, which was not an approved use of the oven, but was effective and did not involve waiting for the landlord to do something about the radiator. He made grilled cheese because it was a Wednesday, and Wednesday was one of the nights when cooking something elaborate felt like an unjustifiable commitment, and Lily set the table without being asked, which she did maybe 40% of the time, and which he had long since stopped trying to make into an every-time thing. They ate. He told her more about the job, the accessible version, the one without the governance language and the policy documents. He told her about the 3 people he'd talked to this week, without names, just that they were people who had been treated unfairly and that part of his job was trying to fix that and then trying to make sure it didn't happen again. She listened with the concentrated attention she gave to things that connected to her own experience of the world, which, he knew, because she had told him in the sideways way children tell you important things, included the residual, still-present unfairness of losing her mother at 4 years old. She had done the math in the way children do, had arrived at the conclusion that things happen that shouldn't, that some things can be fixed and some can't, and that the difference between those categories was not always clear in advance. So you're like, she searched for the framework, the person who checks whether the rules were followed. More like the person who makes sure the rules are worth following, he said, and then checks. She nodded slowly, processing. Then, do you think that lady who fired you is going to be okay? It was not a question he had expected. He set down his grilled cheese. What made you think of that? Lily shrugged in the particular way that meant she had been thinking about it for longer than the shrug implied. You never said anything bad about her, even when you told me what happened. She looked at her plate. Mom always said that when people don't say anything bad about someone who hurt them, it usually means they feel sorry for them. Carson was quiet for a moment. He had not thought about Vanessa Hawthorne at any length since the board session, not because he was suppressing it, just because the forward motion of everything had occupied the space where retrospection might otherwise have lived. But now the question sat in front of him, asked by his 8-year-old with her mother's instinct for the question that cut straight to the center, and he had to actually look at it. Did he feel sorry for Vanessa Hawthorne? He turned it over honestly. She was 30 years old. She had moved very fast to a very high place and had built, he suspected, most of her identity around the acceleration, around being the youngest, the most decisive, the one who didn't hesitate when others did. That was a useful quality in certain contexts and a dangerous one in others, and she had not had, as far as he could tell, anyone in her immediate orbit who was willing to tell her which was which. That was its own kind of deprivation, though not the kind that generated much sympathy in the people it affected. She had also publicly humiliated a man who was doing his job and destroyed 11 years of professional trust in 4 minutes based on an assumption she didn't bother to verify. That was real. That had consequences that went beyond her own career reversal. Both things were true. He had learned over the years that both things being true at once was usually the accurate version of almost any situation. "I think she made a bad mistake," he said finally. "And I think she's probably smart enough to know it now. What she does with knowing it," he shrugged, "that's hers to figure out." Lily looked at him steadily. "But you're not mad at her?" "Not really. Not anymore." "Why not?" He thought about how to say it in terms that were true and also accessible to an 8-year-old. "Because being mad at her would take up space I'd rather use for other things," he said. "And because whatever she did to me, I still came out on the other side with more than I had before." He paused. "That doesn't mean what she did was okay. It just means I don't have to let it be the most important thing." Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her grilled cheese and bit into it and said, with the thoughtful concentration of someone who has reached a conclusion, "Mom would like the new job." Carson looked at his daughter. The butterfly jacket hung on the chair behind her, the peeling wing catching the kitchen light. The backpack sat on the floor with a drawing sticking out of the top pocket. The same drawing he'd noticed before, blue and yellow, its full shape still hidden. He thought about Maya. He thought about the way she used to sit at this same table with her hands wrapped around her coffee mug, listening to him talk about a difficult repair problem with the specific quality of attention that made him feel like what he was saying mattered. She had believed that useful work was its own kind of dignity, and that a person who showed up and did the work honestly was worth more than a person who made a performance of effort. She had believed it, and she had lived it, and she had passed it to her daughter in some channel that had nothing to do with instruction and everything to do with example. "Yeah," he said, "I think she would." After dinner, Lily did her homework at the kitchen table while Carson washed the dishes. She was working on a worksheet about fractions, which she found philosophically irritating in a way she had articulated once as, "Why does a number need to have another number inside it?" And he listened to her mutter through the problems with the fond exasperation of a man who understood fractions perfectly well, but had no useful purchase on why they should be instinctively obvious to a third grader. When she finished, she put the worksheet in her folder and then rummaged in her backpack and pulled out the drawing he'd been seeing the corner of all day. She didn't give it to him immediately. She looked at it for a second with the private expression of someone deciding whether a thing is ready to be shared. Then she set it flat on the kitchen table. It was the two of them. He recognized himself. She had given him the brown hair and the slightly too serious expression she always drew him with, and he was holding what appeared to be a wrench, because to Lily, the wrench was as much his characteristic object as a paintbrush would be for a painter or a stethoscope for a doctor. She had drawn herself next to him with the butterfly jacket and the gap in her teeth visible even in the simplified cartoon face. They were standing under a blue sky with yellow clouds, which were the wrong color but were yellow because she liked yellow. Below the drawing, in the deliberate block letters of a third grader who was working on her handwriting, "Home is wherever Dad is." Carson stood at the kitchen table looking at the drawing. He did not say anything for a moment. He was a man who had a rule about composure. He believed in it, had practiced it, had maintained it in utility corridors and HR offices and board-adjacent conference rooms and all the various arenas where keeping it had been necessary or useful. But composure, he had also learned, has its place and its limitations. And a drawing made by your daughter on the day your world changed and left you standing in a kitchen you were going to be able to keep was not the place for it. He picked up the drawing carefully. "This is good," he said, which was not the right thing to say, and both of them knew it, but it was what came out, and she seemed to understand the whole weight of what was underneath it, because she was her mother's daughter, and that particular understanding was in her bones. "I made it today," she said. "In art. Mrs. Peterson said we could make whatever we wanted." "You made this?" "Mm-hmm." She was watching him with the patient directness of someone who is giving another person time to catch up. "Do you want to keep it?" "Yes," he said. "I absolutely want to keep it." She nodded, satisfied. She re-zipped her backpack. She announced that she was going to brush her teeth and went down the hall, and from the bathroom he heard the water run and the cap click off the toothpaste and the particular sound of an 8-year-old who has not yet developed the patience to brush for a full 2 minutes, but is at least making the attempt. Carson stood at the kitchen table and held the drawing. The apartment was warm now, the oven trick having done its work, the radiator finally clicking on with the grudging belated effort it always produced. Outside the window, the city continued its business, indifferent and necessary, and alive with the ambient hum of 4 million people doing the 10,000 ordinary things that make up a life in a place. He was part of that, had always been part of it. The man in the background who kept the systems running, who fixed the things that failed, who documented what he found and communicated what needed to happen, and went home at the end of the day to the only job that actually mattered. That job was unchanged, would always be unchanged. Whatever title was on his badge, whatever floor he worked on, whatever conference room he sat in translating executive register into plain language and back again. At the end of all of it, this was what he came home to. A kitchen with crayon drawings on the refrigerator and library books on the counter, and a daughter who drew yellow clouds because she liked yellow, and told him, in the plain declarative language of a child who has not learned yet to be indirect about love, exactly what he needed to hear. He put the drawing on the refrigerator, next to the others. He smoothed the tape down carefully at each corner. Then he went down the hall to do the bedtime negotiation, which ran 12 minutes longer than it should have because Lily had discovered a new chapter in her book and believed she had a compelling argument for why 5 more pages was a reasonable request, and which he eventually resolved by reading the 5 pages to her himself in the voice she'd liked since she was 3. The one that was slightly too slow and slightly too serious, like someone reading a very important document, until her eyes started the specific heaviness that meant the argument was over. He turned off her light, stood in the doorway for a second. She was already most of the way asleep, her breathing shifting into the slow rhythm of it, the butterfly jacket hanging on the back of her desk chair, and her backpack on the floor and her book face down on the nightstand, spine slightly bent in a way that would have bothered him if the battle of the bookmarks hadn't been one he'd long ago given up. He closed the door, walked back to the kitchen table, opened his laptop, went back to page 6 of the Operational Integrity Review Protocol. He worked until midnight. When he finally closed the laptop, the document was 11 pages and covered the framework he'd been building in his head since Harold had first described the position in terms Carson had been quietly translating into something concrete ever since. He was not an executive. He was a man who knew how systems failed and what it took to fix them, and he had been given, through a chain of accidents and one old man's instinct and one 8-year-old's drawing on a Wednesday, the chance to apply that knowledge to something larger than a climate control unit on the 42nd floor. He would not waste it. He went to bed. He set his alarm. He looked at the ceiling for a while in the way he did, and then, eventually, he stopped looking at the ceiling. In the morning, there was oatmeal to make, and a daughter to get to school, and a protocol document to finish, and a city full of systems that needed someone to pay attention to them. He was still, at the end of everything, that someone. That had not changed. Nothing essential had changed. He slept. The Operational Integrity Review Protocol went into effect on a Monday morning in early December, 6 weeks after Carson Bennett had signed his appointment documents at a conference table on the 28th floor while wearing the suit that fit mostly and pulling at the collar without realizing it. The protocol was 14 pages in its final form. Diane had proofread it twice. Richard Osei had reviewed it from a governance standpoint and suggested 3 amendments, all of which Carson accepted because they were correct. Harold had read it once, returned it with a single handwritten note in the margin on page 9. Good. And that was the entirety of his editorial input, which Carson had found both gratifying and characteristically Harold. The document specified in plain language that any employee at any level could read and understand exactly what had to happen before any termination decision became final. A documented review process. A direct conversation between the employee and a senior HR representative, not an assistant, not an email. A written statement of cause that was specific enough to be meaningful. A mandatory 72-hour review window during which the employee could respond. And a sign-off from the Director of Operational Integrity on any case involving an employee with more than 1 year of service. That last provision had been Carson's insistence, and the board's only point of extended discussion. Richard had raised the concern about bottlenecks. What happened if the volume of terminations exceeded what one person could realistically review? Carson's answer had been that if termination volume was high enough to create a bottleneck at the review stage, that was itself information that the board needed to take seriously rather than engineer around. Richard had been quiet for a moment and then said that was a fair point and moved on. Patricia Shen had told Carson afterward, in the hallway outside the conference room, that it was the most useful thing anyone had said in a board meeting in the past 8 months. He had thanked her and gone back to his office and immediately spilled coffee on his keyboard, which required 40 minutes of rice and anxiety before the keys started working again, and which felt like the universe's way of keeping his self-assessment calibrated. The first month under the new protocol produced 4 termination review requests. Carson reviewed all 4. 2 were straightforward, genuine performance issues, documented over months, with clear paper trails and employees who had received multiple written notices and had been given real opportunities to respond. He signed off on both. One was murkier, a mid-level manager in the logistics division whose supervisor had filed the case using language that was technically specific but actually described personality conflicts dressed up as performance failures. Carson returned it to HR with a 3-page memo outlining what additional documentation was required and what conversation needed to happen before he could sign off. The supervisor was not pleased. Carson's response to the supervisor's displeasure, delivered through HR in writing, was courteous, specific, and entirely unmoved. The 4th case was the one that kept him at the office until 9 o'clock on a Thursday night, sitting with the file the way he used to sit with a diagnostic printout that wasn't telling him what he expected. The employee's name was Dennis Farrow, 47 years old, building maintenance technician, 9 years of service. The termination request cited chronic tardiness and a pattern of insubordination. The HR file showed 6 written warnings over 18 months. On paper, it was a textbook performance case, exactly the kind that didn't require his intervention. But Carson had read the file twice, and something in it had the specific texture of a story being told in one direction. The tardiness was real. Dennis had been late 43 times in 18 months. But Carson, who had spent 11 years in facilities, knew the shift structures in building maintenance. And he also knew that 43 late arrivals mapped almost exactly to the period after a specific schedule change that had moved Dennis's shift start from 8 a.m. to 6:30 a.m. There was nothing in the file about whether anyone had asked Dennis why the tardiness had started when the schedule changed. The insubordination citations were 3 incidents. Carson read each one. 2 of them described Dennis raising safety concerns in meetings where his supervisor was present. The language in the citations called this disruptive and contrary to team cohesion. Carson sat with that for a long time. He called Dennis Farrow the next morning. Dennis was clearly not expecting the call. He was also clearly a man who had been through enough of the process to have developed the defensive caution of someone who has learned that the institution's interest and his own interest are not the same thing. "Mr. Bennett," he said, Are you calling to tell me it's final?" "No," Carson said. "I'm calling because I read your file and I have questions that aren't answered in it." A pause. "What kind of questions?" "The schedule change in March of last year. Was there a reason the 6:30 start was a problem for you?" A longer pause. Then, carefully, "My son has a medical condition. He needs to be at a treatment facility 3 days a week by 7:15. Before the schedule change, I could drop him and still make my shift. After it, I couldn't." A beat. "I asked my supervisor about a temporary adjustment. He said the schedule was set by operations and he didn't have authority to change it." "Did you put that request in writing?" No, I talked to him in person." "Was anyone else present?" "No." Carson wrote this down. "And the safety concerns you raised in the 3 meetings that are cited as insubordination?" "I raised them because they were real." The defensive caution was giving way to something more direct. There was a ventilation issue in the East Mechanical Room that I flagged 4 times. In writing, twice. The supervisor told me in the meeting that I was creating unnecessary alarm. That's in the citation. The ventilation issue, Carson said. Is it resolved? It was fixed in September, 3 months after I first flagged it, after a facilities inspection found it independently. Carson set his pen down. Mr. Farrow, he said, I'm not going to sign off on this termination. The silence on the other end had a particular quality. The silence of someone who has been braced for a blow and is recalibrating because it didn't come. What does that mean? Dennis said. It means I'm returning the case to HR with a recommendation that the schedule accommodation request be formally processed, retroactively documented, and that the tardiness record be reviewed in that context. It also means I'm recommending that the 3 insubordination citations be reclassified. He paused. I can't promise what HR will do with my recommendation, but I can tell you what it will say. Another long silence. Why are you doing this? Carson thought about the question. He could have given the official version, the mandate of his position, the procedural obligations, the board's commitment to due process. All of that was true, and none of it was the whole answer. Because 9 years ago, someone looked at your file when you were hired and decided you were worth having in the building, he said. And the same file should be looked at carefully before anyone decides the opposite. Dennis Farrow didn't say anything for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the compressed quality of someone managing something they don't want to lose control of. Nobody's talked to me like that in a year and a half of this process. I know, Carson said. That's what I'm here to fix. The Dennis Farrow case took 3 more weeks to resolve. HR processed the accommodation request retroactively, reclassified most of the tardiness record, and closed 2 of the 3 insubordination citations after reviewing the ventilation inspection report that had independently confirmed everything Dennis had raised. The 3rd citation, an incident that was genuinely a problem, where Dennis had spoken to his supervisor in a way that crossed a line regardless of the underlying frustration, was retained, but is a single incident in a 9-year file rather than the capstone of an escalating pattern. Dennis kept his job. He stopped being late once the accommodation was in place. He sent Carson a text 3 weeks later that said only, "My son's doing better. Thank you." Carson read it at his desk and then set his phone face down because some things are better absorbed without looking at them directly. The Farrow case became, within Novaris, a kind of reference point. The moment when people in the building understood that the Director of Operational Integrity was not a ceremonial title or a PR gesture. Word moved through organizations the way it always does, faster than official communications and with more detail, and what moved through Novaris in the weeks after the Farrow resolution was the specific useful information that someone in that building was actually reading the files. It changed things in ways Carson hadn't anticipated. Managers began documenting more carefully, not to build cases, but because they understood someone was going to read what they wrote and ask whether it said what they meant. Employees began raising concerns through official channels because there was evidence those channels went somewhere. 3 separate supervisors came to Carson in his first 3 months not to file termination requests, but to ask for advice on managing performance situations they hadn't known how to handle, which was not technically within his mandate, but which he engaged with anyway, because the mandate had always been about the culture as much as the paperwork. Diane told him, around the 4th month, that people were calling the 28th floor by a new informal name. He asked what it was. The accountability floor, she said. He thought about that. That's a little heavy. Would you prefer something lighter? I'd prefer people not name it at all. That's not how buildings work, she said. You know that. He did know that. Buildings developed their own language, their own informal cartography of what happened where and who you went to for what. He had navigated that cartography for 11 years from the other side. And now he was part of it in a different way. And the adjustment was ongoing and imperfect, and sometimes he still walked into executive meetings and spent the first 10 minutes translating and the next 10 minutes deciding which of his 37 items to raise and which to hold. He made mistakes. He signed off on a termination in his 3rd month that he later determined he should have returned for additional review. The documentation had been sufficient on paper but insufficient in the way that mattered. and the employee had appealed through HR, and Carson had read the appeal and understood that he had moved too quickly in a way that replicated, in miniature and with better paperwork, exactly what he had been hired to prevent. He wrote himself a memo about it. He added a step to his own review process. He told Harold what had happened because Harold had earned that information, and because Carson was not a man who managed his own record by omission. Harold had listened to the whole account and then said, "What did you change?" Added a direct call with the employee as a required step, not optional before I sign off on any case, even the clean ones. "Good," Harold said. "That's the right response." "It happened because I was moving too fast." "Yes. You're learning. Keep learning." It was not absolution. It wasn't meant to be. But it was the kind of response that Harold had always given, in 4 years of Saturday mornings, and now in this, not comfort exactly, but engagement. The actual engagement of someone who takes you seriously enough to hold you to the standard you said you believed in. Spring arrived in the way it always did in the city, badly, and then suddenly, 1 week of raw cold followed by an almost overnight shift where the trees went from bare to cautiously green, and the afternoon light lasted long enough to feel like a gift. Carson had driven this part of the city for 11 years, and he noticed the seasonal shift, the way you notice things you've seen enough times to recognize without looking for them. Lily's science fair was on a Friday in late April. She had been working on the experiment since the Saturday in December when they'd bought the grow lights, 3 of them, 1 full spectrum, 1 red dominant, 1 blue dominant, positioned over identical soil, identical seed variety, watered on the same schedule, observed and measured every day for 16 weeks, and recorded in the notebook Carson had gotten her along with the lights. She had missed 1 entry, a Wednesday in February, when she'd had a fever and fell asleep before she could write it. She had been genuinely upset about the gap in the data, which Carson found both endearing and scientifically appropriate, and told her so in terms that made her feel slightly better about the Wednesday, but no less precise about everything that came after. The result, which she had worked out herself, with Carson available for math checking but not for interpretation, was that the full spectrum light produced the most consistent growth. The blue dominant produced faster initial germination but shorter overall height, and the red dominant produced the tallest plants but with the most variation between individual specimens. Her conclusion section used the word variables correctly 4 times, and the word therefore once in a way that was grammatically sound and logically supported, which Carson considered a scientific achievement regardless of what the judges thought. The judges gave her 2nd place. She was fine about it for approximately 7 minutes after the announcement, during which she told Carson that 2nd place was a good result and she was proud of the work. Then on the drive home, she went quiet in the way that meant the fine about it version was being replaced by the actual version, and Carson let her be quiet for most of the drive before he said, "The data was good." "I know." "The methodology was sound." "I know, Dad." "The kid who won had a demonstration with a motor in it." A pause. "It was a pretty good motor." "It was a good motor." "It's also not what your project was about. Your project was about a hypothesis, evidence, and a conclusion. That's science. The motor was engineering." Lily was quiet for another block. "Is that you making me feel better? Or is that true?" "Both," he said. "The 2 things aren't mutually exclusive." She thought about this. "Okay," she said, "but I still wish I'd won." "Yeah, that's also allowed." She leaned against the window for the rest of the drive. When they got home, she put her project board in her room and came out to eat dinner, and by the time she was doing homework at the kitchen table, she was talking about the hypothesis for next year's project, which involved soil pH and earthworm behavior, and had apparently been forming in the back of her mind for the past 3 weeks alongside the current project, because that was how her mind worked, and had always worked, and would, he suspected, continue to work in ways that would make her formidable at whatever she eventually decided to do with it. He watched her work and ate his dinner and thought about the kind of father he was, which he did periodically with the specific critical eye he brought to systems assessments, looking for where the process could be better, where he cut corners, where he'd been good enough and where good enough wasn't. He was too inside his own head sometimes. Maya had told him that. He stayed too late at work now, not every night, but often enough that he knew Lily was doing a version of the quiet waiting management that she had learned, like all children of distracted parents, out of necessity. He was working on that. He had put a hard 6:30 out of office on his calendar and enforced it most days, which was an improvement over where he'd started and not yet where he needed to be. He also was not great at asking for help, which had been true his whole life and which single fatherhood had calcified into something structural. Diane had pointed out, with characteristic directness, that he had not taken a single vacation day in 6 months and that this was not sustainable, and also set a bad example for the operational culture he was supposedly trying to rebuild. He had told her she was right, which she was, and had not yet taken a vacation day, which she had also predicted. These were the actual facts of his life, not the polished version, not the narrative of the man who lost everything and came back stronger, but the actual version, the man who was doing better, genuinely better, and still burned oatmeal on rushed mornings and pulled at his collar and sometimes lay awake at 2 a.m. with the ceiling and a list of things he hadn't finished yet. The thing about integrity, he had come to understand, was that it was not a destination. It wasn't a state you arrived at after enough right decisions and stayed in, undisturbed. It was something you practiced, the way a musician practiced scales, not because the scales were the point, but because the point was impossible without them. And practice meant getting it wrong sometimes, and correcting, and continuing, and getting it wrong differently next time, and correcting again. That was the protocol. That was what he was trying to build into the institution, and it was also what he was trying, daily and imperfectly, to model in everything outside the institution. Summer came. Lily finished 3rd grade with a teacher's note that said she was curious, stubborn in the best sense, and unusually good at asking why. Carson read the note twice and put it on the refrigerator next to the drawing with the yellow clouds. The science camp, the one with the robots, the one that cost $1,100, had a July session and an August session. He had looked it up again in March, when the new paycheck had made the number change from impossible to possible, and had registered her for July before he could second-guess it. She had received the confirmation email at the kitchen table and read it with the same concentrated expression she gave to science hypotheses, and then looked up at him and said, "This is real." "It's real," he said. "You actually signed me up." "I actually signed you up." She stared at the email for another second. Then she closed the laptop very carefully, like a person who doesn't want to disturb something fragile, and went down the hall to her room and shut the door. He heard nothing from the room for about 4 minutes, and then heard a sound that was extremely brief and that she would subsequently deny had been a victory noise. He let her have the privacy of it. The camp was 2 weeks in July, residential, at a university facility 40 minutes from the city. He drove her there on a Sunday morning with her duffel bag and her notebook and a Ziploc bag of granola bars she had insisted on bringing because she did not trust institutional snacks, which was, he thought, watching her march through the registration line with her bag over one shoulder and her notebook already in her hand, a profoundly Lily approach to a new situation. At the door of the dormitory, she turned around. She was 9 now, had turned 9 in June, which she had received with the mixed emotions of a person who was glad to be older and mildly aggrieved at the rate of progress. She looked at him across the small distance of the doorway with the gap-toothed smile. The tooth had come back in March, fully, but the new one sat at a slight angle that the dentist said would correct itself. And in the meantime, it gave her smile a quirk that was different from the gap, but equally her own. "Dad." "Yeah. If I build the best robot, will you be proud of me?" He looked at his daughter in the doorway of a dormitory she had waited 2 years to walk into, holding a notebook full of observations about grow lights and plant heights and variables that she had measured every single day for 16 weeks, even when she had a fever. "I'm already proud of you, he said. "Build the robot because you want to build it." She considered this. "That's not really an answer to my question." "Yes, it is. It's a dad answer. Those are the only answers I've got." She gave him the quirk-toothed smile, and then she turned around and walked inside. And he stood in the doorway for a moment watching her go. The duffel bag bouncing, the notebook clutched in one hand, already looking around at the space with the focused curiosity of someone who is cataloging a new environment for future use. Then the door closed and he walked back to his truck alone. He sat in the driver's seat for a minute. The campus around him was quiet in the particular way of institutions that haven't filled up yet. The buildings patient and waiting, the pathways empty in the morning light. He was 45 minutes from the city, and he had the next 2 weeks without school pickups or bedtime negotiations or homework at the kitchen table, and he wasn't entirely sure what to do with that, which told him something about how thoroughly his life had become organized around another person's needs, and which he considered not as a loss, but as the evidence of a choice he had made and would always make the same way. He drove back to the city. He stopped at the coffee place. He sat at the window table and opened his laptop and worked for 3 hours, which was not the vacation Diane had in mind, but was, he told himself, a transitional step. On the way home, he drove past the building, the Novaris headquarters. He hadn't done this deliberately. It was on his route. But he found himself slowing at the corner, looking up at it. 40 stories. The particular glass and steel construction that he knew from the inside better than anyone, knew where the systems ran and where they were prone to failure, and what sounds different mechanical failures made at different hours of the day. The 42nd floor looked the same as every other floor from the outside, windows catching the summer light, giving nothing away. He thought about Vanessa Hawthorne. He had not seen her since the board session. After her removal from active leadership, the full review of her tenure had taken 11 weeks and produced a finding that was, in the language of corporate governance, mixed. Significant strategic accomplishments alongside the pattern of procedural failures that had brought everything down. The board had eventually reached a separation agreement that neither Harold nor Richard Osei had discussed publicly in terms that told Carson more than the official version, but the fact that it had taken 11 weeks told him it hadn't been simple. He knew, through Patricia Shen, that Vanessa had spent several months out of public life entirely. No new executive appointments, no media presence, none of the usual post-departure board seats that high-profile executives typically accumulated within weeks. Patricia had mentioned it not as gossip, but as observation, the way you observe something that is neither good nor bad, and let the observation sit. Carson had sat with it. He didn't know what Vanessa Hawthorne did with the year after Novaris, what she learned or didn't learn, whether the experience had changed the way she moved through rooms full of people who were doing work she hadn't thought to look at. He hoped, and this was genuinely hope, not the thin version of it that's actually another kind of judgment, that she had found a way to take what happened and do something useful with it. Not because she deserved his goodwill, but because people who were smart and driven and genuinely capable doing the work of learning from their failures was better for everyone than those same people deciding the failure was the world's problem rather than theirs. He had no way of knowing. He probably never would. And that was the actual shape of it, the messy, unresolved, real version of forgiveness. Not a moment where you decided someone was redeemed and moved on with your life, but the gradual process of letting a wrong recede from the center of your attention because you had other things to do that mattered more. He had a protocol to refine and a department to advocate for, and a daughter building robots 40 minutes away, and those things took up the space where the grievance might otherwise have lived. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, almost everything. He pulled back into traffic and drove home. The apartment felt different with Lily gone. Not empty exactly, but revealed the way a room looks when you move the furniture and see the floor underneath. He cleaned the kitchen. He went through the stack of library books on the counter and returned the ones that were overdue, which was 4 of them and cost him $8 in fines, which Lily would have considered outrageous on principle. He fixed the flickering light in the hallway that the building super had still not addressed, because he had access to a maintenance closet in the building's utility room and the right bulb in 8 minutes, and some habits are more fundamental than job titles. He called Harold on a Tuesday evening, not about work, about Saturday, about whether Harold was still going to the Veterans Center, because Carson was thinking of going back, not every week, but when he could. Harold had been quiet for a moment, then, "I'll be there this Saturday. The autoclave's been making a sound it shouldn't." "I'll bring tools," Carson said. "I assumed you would." He went on Saturday. The center looked the same. The linoleum floors, the donated equipment arranged with Bev's particular organizational logic, the smell of coffee from the kitchen that was always slightly too strong. Harold was already there when Carson arrived, standing in the equipment room with his arms crossed, looking at the autoclave with the critical attention of a man who does not accept machines behaving badly. "There," Harold said when Carson walked in. "That sound." Carson listened. He heard it, a faint cycling irregularity, a pitch variation in the pressure relief that suggested a worn gasket or a partially blocked vent. 20 minutes, Carson said. He set down his toolbox. "I've missed this," Harold said. "The autoclave being broken?" "The straightforward version of the work." Harold sat down on a stool in the corner. "Everything becomes complicated at a certain level. It's useful sometimes to come back to something that has a specific problem and a specific solution." Carson crouched by the machine and opened the panel. "Does it get better?" "The complicated part." "You get better at it," Harold said. "That's not entirely the same thing." Carson found the gasket. It was worn at the valve seat exactly where he'd expected. He had the replacement in his toolbox because he'd looked up the autoclave model before he came, which was a reflex so ingrained he'd done it without thinking about it. "Harold," he said while he worked. "Yes." "The job. Do you think it's working?" A pause. "You've been in it 6 months." "I know, but you've been watching it longer than I have." Another pause. Longer. Harold had the quality that Carson had come to understand was not deliberateness for its own sake, but the genuine processing time of a man who did not answer questions before he had actually thought about them. "I think it's working in the way that real things work," Harold said finally. "Imperfectly, with visible seams, more slowly than you'd like, and in directions you don't fully control." Dennis Farrow kept his job. Yolanda Okonkwo came back to the company last month. He paused. And the 14 managers who filed termination requests in the last quarter all submitted documentation that was, for the first time, actually sufficient. That means they thought harder before they decided. That's not nothing. Carson replaced the gasket, started reassembling the panel. "Okonkwo came back?" "Accepted a senior project manager role last week. She negotiated for 2 weeks." A brief, satisfied sound that was almost a laugh. "She's going to be very good." Carson tightened the last fitting, closed the panel, ran the restart sequence. The autoclave cycled, and the sound it made was even and clean, the sound of a machine doing what it was built to do without interruption. "Good," Harold said. "Harold, the gasket was worn at the valve seat," Carson said. "It'll need to be checked again in about a year." "I'll put it in the calendar." They worked for another 2 hours. Carson threw the equipment list Bev produced with the efficiency of someone who had been maintaining it for years. Harold mostly sitting on his stool and occasionally handing tools, and occasionally saying something that was either about the work or about something else entirely, and the line between the two was comfortable in the way of long acquaintance. On the drive home, Carson thought about the things that couldn't be measured. The Dennis Farrow text, "My son's doing better," that he still had on his phone. The look on Elena Gutierrez's face when she'd ordered coffee after spending the first 8 minutes of their meeting drinking water. The operational integrity protocol, 14 pages, now cited in 3 separate HR decisions as the standard by which cases were evaluated. The drawing on the refrigerator. Yellow clouds. A wrench. 2 people standing under a blue sky. He thought about what Lily had written under the drawing and what it meant to be the person that sentence was about. Not the executive, not the title, not the protocol, just the man in the drawing, holding the wrench, standing next to his kid, who had decided at some point that her definition of home was wherever he was. That was the weight of it. The real weight. The one that didn't go in a board document or an employment file or a 14-page protocol. The weight of being looked at by someone who depends on you and deciding every day, in the small choices and the large ones, what they're going to see. He had not gotten it right every day. He would not get it right every day from here forward. He would stay too late sometimes and miss things he should have caught, and make decisions he would later want to take back, and he would lay awake with the ceiling on the nights when the accounting didn't balance, which would happen because it always happened, because that was the arithmetic of trying. But he would also fix the autoclave when it made the wrong sound. He would read the file. He would make the call. He would ask the question before making the decision. He would drive 40 minutes to drop his daughter at a science camp and stand in the doorway and tell her to build the robot because she wanted to, not because it would make him proud, because the distinction mattered, and she was old enough to understand why. He would go home every evening to the apartment with the crayon drawings on the refrigerator and the spacecraft model that had, in the last 3 months, been completed and then partially disassembled to incorporate a modification Lily had designed herself. And he would be the father whose character she was watching, whether he thought about it or not, whether he was aware of it or not, the way children watch the people they love, not for the speeches or the lessons, but for the ordinary evidence of who a person actually is when the stakes are real and nobody is taking notes. That was the job. The actual job. The one underneath all the other jobs. He had been doing it for 9 years. He intended to keep doing it. He pulled into the parking space behind the apartment building, turned off the truck, sat for a moment in the quiet that he was still getting used to. 2 weeks of a kitchen without Lily in it, a silence that was not bad but was unmistakably her absence, which was its own kind of reminder of what the presence meant. He got out of the truck, took his toolbox from the back, walked inside, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table where the drawing still hung on the refrigerator, the tape holding at all 4 corners, the yellow clouds unbothered by time. He looked at it for a while. Then he opened his laptop and went back to work, because there were people in that building who deserved someone paying attention, and that was a job that did not pause for sentiment. And he was still, underneath everything, the man who showed up to fix what was broken and stayed until it was done. That had not changed. It would not change. It was, when you got down to the actual foundation of the thing, the load-bearing structure beneath all the rest of it, who he was. And who he was, it turned out, had been enough. Not perfect. Not without cost. Not without the particular quiet grief of a man who had lost something essential and learned to carry it rather than put it down. Not without the daily imperfect effort of showing up and making the call and reading the file and going home to make dinner and ask about the hypothesis and sit in the ordinary difficulty of a life that demanded things from him every day. But enough. He finished his coffee, rinsed the mug, stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the city that was doing what cities do, continuing, indifferent, necessary, alive with the 10,000 small operations that kept it running, most of them performed by people nobody thought about until something stopped working. He thought about them. He usually did. Then he turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and in the morning there would be more work, and he would do it, and it would matter. And that was the whole of what he had ever asked for. It was, it turned out, more than enough.